I hope you all can see my screen. So thank you for having me here. And I will, since I've already spent a bit of time, I'll just start away. My presentation is about understanding the Hinduphobic biases of South Asian feminism from a decolonial indigenous lens. Without further ado, and since we're sort of stripped of time, I will directly straight up dive into it. I study these understanding Hinduphobic biases using a case study specifically for Sabarimala, using the Sabarimala temple case. This case study was chosen for its relevance, timing, and the author's familiarity with the issue. It's possible that many of you may have heard about this issue or followed along as it was unfolding a couple of years ago. Even if you did not, we will provide the context and information as relevant for this presentation. More resources can definitely be found online, including our website on shaktitva.org. As Hindus, we cannot avoid being the target of Hinduphobia, and thus, while my co-founder was directly affected by the case study in question, I do not consider it a conflict of interest. However, I do consider it worthy of disclosure. So that's, that's before we begin, I just wanted to mention that. So what happened at Sabarimala? Now, before we dive into what happened, Sabarimala is a centuries-old temple, which has a unique practice where the deity's vow of Naishtik celibacy means that the temple restricts entry of women in their fertile ages. Naishtik Brahmacharya is a well-documented and well-understood practice of extreme celibacy. Very few people, very few ordinary people venture far enough in their spiritual practices to ask to take this vow, and arguably only a few deities are known to have taken this vow, Lord Ayappa being one of them. As a result, the Sabarimala temple has been consecrated, specifically keeping the deity's extreme celibacy vow in mind. And such are and following the Agama traditions, this is how the temple's rituals are constructed. Now, unfortunately, Sabarimala temple's history has been directly impacted by the changing landscape of Indian politics over the last 100 years or so. For the sake of brevity, we shall restrict our gaze to recent events and provide context as and when relevant. One thing to note here, though, is that attempts of British colonists to civilize and manage Hindus led to Hindu temples being brought under the state machinery, which allows for state controlling temple finances. It also allows courts to arbitrarily interfere in generational temple practices and indigenous rituals. Given that, note that in 1990, a Hindu devotee reached out to Kerala High Court asking them to legalize the traditional restriction on entry of women. As is with the case with legalization, the term women of fertile age, which was loosely implied and not enforced, however followed strictly by the devotees, turned into a term of 10 to 50 age range. This 10 to 50 years of age range was a number that the Kerala High Court tried to put on this. Note there can be situations where menopause of a woman lasts beyond 50. So this is not a direct, is not absolutely perfect translation of the traditional restriction. However, it formalizes the language. This, unfortunately, then opens the door for this legalized restriction to then be challenged, which is exactly what happened in 2006, when 6 female members of Indian Lawyers Association file a PIL requesting Indian Supreme Court to lift the traditional restriction on the entry of women. The framing of the arguments reflected the South Asian feminist mainstream discourse, which was directly referred into the court documents of the PIL, arguing that such a restriction is against female empowerment, it is against the rights of women to enter public spaces, and thus unconstitutional. After a prolonged battle of 12 years, in 2018, Indian Supreme Court orders the temple to allow entry of women of all ages, going against the temple tradition. It is pertinent to note here that in the 6-member judicial committee that adjudicated this particular PIL, the only female Supreme Court judge, Mrs. Indu Malhotra, issued a dissenting order and disagreed with the judgment. However, after the judgment was passed, international protests ensued, which led to a review petition, which puts the lifting of ban on hold. So that's the status quo as of now. And this is the background of the situation. Now, note, as I mentioned before, that the post-colonial Indian state often uses a Western lens to adjudicate these matters. This temple and its traditions have been subjected to much criticism from mainstream feminism, a lot of which has found its way into the Indian state's view of these traditions. So as a result, we decided to study the reactions of mainstream South Asian feminists to the social response to the Sabarimala judgment and the legal battle, which reveal now a pattern of biased analysis being used to dismiss criticism, erase indigenous and female voices, to present a savior feminist view as the only legitimate form of feminism. So let's dive straight into it. The first pattern that we observed was erasure of Hindu women's agency. We studied various writings of South Asian feminists in both popular and academic spaces, and discovered problematic patterns in their arguments, which were essentially biased and Hinduphobic in their nature, to dismiss criticism to their positions. We analyzed some of those patterns here. First, Hindu devotees aren't women, even when they are. Note the caption in this little screen cap that I got from a very popular Indian media website. Devotees block cars and buses to check for women traveling to Sabarimala. Few women were also asked to get off the bus and go back near Nilakkal in Sabarimala ahead of its scheduled opening for women. Note who are the devotees that are walking into the bus. They are women. However, these women are only devotees, whereas the general population trying to enter the temple are the only one who have been bestowed with the honor of being called women. Media coverage of the protests against this judgment consistently framed the issue as Hindus versus women, even when Hindu women, including many tribal women, were at the forefront of the struggle. This was arguably one of the most prolific patterns that we noted, where this distinction was being drawn. Note, again, look at this image is from Reuters. Note how the title says Hindu devotees stop a car to check if any women of menstruating age are headed towards the Sabarimala temple. Again, these devotees happen to be women, but it's a distinction between Hindu devotees and women. Journalist Barkha Dutt's article in the Washington Post titled "The Standoff at Sabarimala States India's Progress on Women's Rights" from January 3rd, 2019 makes no mention of the women-led counter-protests on the streets of Kerala to preserve the tradition. All counter-protests are instead bundled under violent street protests led by right-wing groups. This initially may seem harmless at first, but it is deeply problematic since this forced distinction attempts to imply that all Hindu voices speaking for this tradition are essentially male, even when it is a woman expressing those opinions. Essentially, this implies that Hindu women voices are not worthy of attention. They are merely regurgitations of their male counterparts because they are essentially incapable of agency. Often the term internalized patriarchy appears to be used. Women who oppose South Asian feminists are dismissed as political mouthpieces, brainwashed, or having ulterior motives, and thus can be erased from the discourse entirely. Second most visible pattern is the label of the Savarna woman. In this method of erasure, the speaker's caste identity is assumed. Even if the caste identity is unknown, the Savarna label is then used to categorize the entire line of argument, regardless of the speaker's antecedents. In these excerpts that I've highlighted from the paper of Ms. J. Devika, in her paper, The Defense of Acharam, Femininity, and Neo-Savarna Power in Kerala, The author assumes the caste of the organizers and participants of the ready-to-wait movement, incorrectly, if I may add, since I happen to know the participants and the organizers, and dismisses the entire argument presented over a period of several years by the movement of ready-to-wait as neo-Savarna attempts to maximize caste power. Later on, you will see in other parts of the evidence I will present, there are also other papers that acknowledge that Sabarimala temple is open and is valued by people of all castes, and yet a superficial caste angle is sort of imposed over here simply to dismiss the Savarna woman. So when the woman cannot be erased, she can now be erased through the Savarna label. This continues. In author Rashmi Kumari, in her paper titled Menstruating Women and Celibate Gods, published in Third World Thematics, argues that the Hindu woman's agency is obscured because of the dichotomy of the rights versus patriarchal oppression framework while discussing women's experiences of religion. Note the term claim to agency. This is an oft-repeated term in South Asian feminist literature when discussing the response of Hindu women to issues emerging from the Indian state's acceptance of mainstream savior feminism. Claim to agency implies agency is not present, just claimed. And later on, it is dismissed. Now note, the third form of erasure of the Hindu woman's agency is that it is women versus feminist. Those who disagree are not feminists. The language of Savarna feminists, frenemies with feminism, hatred of feminists, assigns hidden casteist and anti-feminist motives to people simply practicing and defending Hindu traditions, because Hinduism is assumed to be inextricably linked to caste. Therefore, even the lack of acknowledgement of caste in an issue where it's not overtly present, such as Sabarimala, is seen as an ulterior motive to maximize caste power or to assert neo-Savarna tendencies. This colonial framing is enforced regardless of the caste identity of practitioners. I highlight that again, because note that the protests, the people they're talking about were essentially women whose caste identity was unknown to these authors, sometimes obscured by different surnames, so it was not easily deducible. And also tribal women were at the forefront of those protests, and yet we see all of this language being used to deny the Hindu woman's agency. It is important to note here that this erasure of Hindu women's voices and denial of agency is not the same as the difference of opinions between second wave feminists and intersectional feminists. These same South Asian feminist authors in question reject Hindu women's call to uphold acharam or tradition in Sabarimala by arguing that upholding of patriarchal values of a religious tradition by definition cancels the claim of agency of the woman, which means that you cannot argue, if you are a feminist, you cannot argue for the traditions if you're a Hindu feminist. Or if you do, conversely, if you do argue for upholding the tradition, then your feminist credentials are canceled. But at the same time, they do support, understand, and even laud the justified call of the modern Muslim woman to consider the hijab as a choice. So this is not a difference of opinion that you often see in the West between second wave feminism and intersectional feminists. This is essentially a Hinduphobic this is essentially an Hinduphobic expression, because their opposition is not to the religious woman's demand to stop the attempts of saving her from her religion, but it is specifically to the right to practice Hinduism itself. Thus, I bring to you I will summarize. There is a lot of evidence in the same stream of thought, which I won't go into for a dearth of time. There are several other problematic assertions. However, these three methods of erasure of Hindu women's voices are most commonly seen. In summary, South Asian feminists argue for liberation of women from Hinduism as the only acceptable way to embrace modernity, a key position of 19th century white feminism with respect to indigenous women, A parallel to Alice Fletcher's analysis of Lakota and Omaha women comes to mind when studying these assertions. Women who disagree with them are either not acknowledged at all or dismissed as mouthpieces of BJP or right-wing parties and organizations, dismissed as the Savarna woman whose voices are to be assumed to be inherently casteist, dismissed as brainwashed or lacking agency to have any valuable opinion, or dismissed as anti-feminist since the only form of feminism that South Asian feminists acknowledge is their own. From the working definition of Hinduphobia, making unsubstantiated claims about the political agendas of people who are simply practicing Hinduism, maintaining that all inequity in Indian society, including but not limited to sati, caste, misogyny, communal violence, and destruction of places of worship stem from and are inextricably bound up with Hinduism, calling for the destruction and dissolution of Hinduism on the basis of its alleged inherent irredeemability are all signs of Hinduphobia. I will move on to the next section of the Hinduphobic patterns that have been noticed, which in this case is essentially erasure of indigenous peoples' agencies. Note that Lord Ayappa's worship and the tradition in Sabarimala is older than modern Indian state and the arrival of colonists on Indian mainlands. Now, a vast majority of South Asian scholarship in general, but feminist scholarship in particular, attempts to draw a distinction between tribal religion and Hinduism. In this worldview, the relationship of Hinduism to tribal religions is the same as that of Christianity vis-a-vis pre-Christian pagan religions. That is, Hinduism is either seen as a civilizing force or an appropriating force, depending on how civilizing is seen by the author in question. In these excerpts taken from Parvati Memon's paper from social scientists titled Sabarimala and Women's Identity in Kerala, you can see that a common pattern used to deny indigeneity of Hindu traditions is creating this false distinction. This claim originates from problematic colonial scholarship that uses philology to map world religions in the order of their advancement, wherein the nature-worshipping indigenous religions represent unadvanced savagery, and Western religions represent the epitome of advancement. Despite the fact that these Orientalist theories have been debunked widely by scholars, their Hinduphobic corollaries continue to be used in South Asian feminist literature. I would highlight another interesting thing. In the second screenshot, you can note the author is actually using the fact that the temple is open to pilgrims of all castes and religions as an argument to argue that tribal religion has been appropriated into Hinduism, dismissing the entirety of the arguments by Hindu scholars past and present that casteism is not inherent to temple worship. Continuing that, we also see more evidence in the same paper. Note that armed with the worldview where forest religions were less civilized than the urban religions, colonialists have argued that since Hindu practices seem to incorporate both nature-worshipping aspects as well as elaborately constructed temples, it must mean that these are distinct faith systems in the process of merging or appropriation. This worldview was an attempt to impose Western-centric worldviews upon the global South and is visibly problematic, yet it repeatedly finds its ways into South Asian feminist scholarship. Here, Parvati Menon is actually arguing that the Sabarimala worship does not constitute a distinct subset because it is an appropriation of the pre-Vedic forest tutelary deity's shrine into pan-Hindu Vedic place of worship. The second aspect of erasure of indigenous peoples' agencies is the denial of oral histories as legitimate histories. This is a very common pattern which seeks to erase the ability of indigenous traditions to express their own histories by using the language of objectivity and authority. In most cases in such scholarship, the only people objective enough to write Hindu history are non-Hindus, and the only authority lies with the colonial sources due to their implied objectivity. This is explored in great detail by Adluri and Bakchi in their book, The Nay Science, which explains how this is a racialized argument that undermines the agency of the non-white population by painting them as emotional people incapable of objectivity when speaking to their own histories. In this particular instance, after citing a plethora of colonialist accounts as authoritative sources of truth to construct the history of the Sabarimala temple, author Parvati Menon in her paper admits that the reconstruction of the temple's history is complex and requires analysis of oral traditions, which is immediately then dismissed as the legitimacy of Indian oral traditions is material for folklorists and not historians. The third aspect of erasure of indigenous people's agency is the complete erasure of their voices at all, which is a similar pattern to what we saw in the case of Hindu women. Despite the large-scale participation of tribal groups from nearby regions, a lot of whom gave interviews to mainstream newspapers, and note, most of those people would qualify for the Avarna classification in South Asian studies. These groups and their voices were continuously erased and folded under violent right-wing protests in a majority of newspaper coverage that we studied. Just like its dealings with Hindu women, these voices were practically erased. It is, and therefore, instead, all the protesting voices were labeled as violent right-wing protests. Finally, South Asian feminists draw a false distinction between tribal religions of India and Hinduism. This is based on Western scholarship, which seeks to define Hinduism as a modern, often political phenomena rather than an indigenous faith system. In that context, any participation of tribal groups in Hindu tradition is seen as an appropriation of tribal traditions by Vedic Hinduism, brainwashing, and any tribal clarifying that Sabarimala traditions are there for centuries are dismissed as folklore. Again, quoting from the working definition of Hinduphobia, claiming that Hinduism or Sanatan Dharma does not exist as a valid, cohesive category of spiritual traditions is Hinduphobia. In conclusion, I would say that the South Asian feminism appears to be a mix of second wave feminist goals and colonialist worldviews, which has dominated the public and academic discourse for decades in the region. Its theories where Western paradigms are applied to indigenous discourses without critical analysis are being challenged by indigenous groups that are finally finding a voice. Sadly, the initial response from South Asian feminism, as highlighted by the study, seems dismissive, full of erasure of alternative viewpoints in the favor of colonial authority. It is this author's hope that this presentation and its subsequent publication will allow South Asian feminists to explore the topics of decoloniality, indigeneity, and indigenous feminism in greater depth. Namaste and thank you.
For the latest on our YouTube channel, click subscribe and hit the bell icon for alerts on new content. Remember to like, comment, and share our videos. For more about HSC, you can visit the social media handles listed below.